Thank you for joining me today in my presentation as part of the National Conference on Peer Tutoring in Writing. My presentation today is entitled Sustaining Community Literacy Efforts Through a Rhetoric of Respect. I thought I would start by introducing myself briefly. My name is Rachel Rodriguez. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in Rhetoric and Composition at the University of Louisville. This presentation is based off some work that I did for the past 2 years in my role as an assistant director of the University Writing Center. My position there entailed coordinating 2 community engagement initiatives, and I'll be talking today about one of them, which was at the Western branch of the Louisville Free Public Library. Here's a quick overview of my presentation today. I'll be giving you my theoretical framework, then talking a little bit about the site, and then giving some kind of hands-on advice on forming new relationships, facing tensions, determining an agenda, gearing up, checking in, and reflecting and revising. And then I'll kind of cap the presentation with a where are we now. For my theoretical framework, I consider the work being done in our community engagement sites to be trifold, based on theories of participatory action research, hospitality, and a rhetoric of respect. Participatory action research, also known as PAR, is a methodology that foregrounds collaborative inquiry and considers both the community and the researcher as working together in a dual aim. Hospitality is based on Richard and Janice Haswell's work. It's a disposition of willingness to set aside your ego and your voice in favor of deep listening. And finally, a rhetoric of respect by Tiffany Rouse-Culp, which respects another's value while simultaneously being aware of your own strengths and weaknesses rather than, say, having a disdain for the subjects of research. If you're interested in more on this, you can see in the upper right-hand corner a citation for the spring 2019 issue of Community Literacy Journal by Bronwyn Williams, the current director of the UWC and a former assistant director from a few years back. So for any of my listeners who may be visually impaired, this slide and the next 2 slides feature photographs of the Western Branch Library. This first slide shows an exterior view and one of the interior views of the modern-day library in color, and the next 2 slides feature some historical photographs from the 1920s through the 1950s, just to kind of give a sense of the library's history. So this is the Western branch of the Louisville Free Public Library. It was built in 1908 as one of Louisville's 9 Carnegie libraries, and it was the first library in the nation to both serve and be operated by African Americans. You can see here in the upper right-hand corner, this is one of the basement spaces where we did a lot of the programming for the children of the library because sometimes that could get quite noisy. This gives you a sense of the scope of the main area of the library and an image of some of its early librarians. Western Branch is one of only 2 originally segregated libraries still operating today. Today, over 2/3 of West Louisville is still African American, and the Western Branch Library's mission is to serve that population. I include this photo, which includes a couple of views of children engaging in reading and writing practices in the library, just to demonstrate that children have always been part of the core of Western Branch Library. Even to this day, during my time tutoring at the library, which was in the late afternoon, I would say probably a good 80% of the patrons in the library were young children. So it's definitely a joyful place full of noise and happy fun. When you're considering forming a new relationship with a community partner, there are some questions that I would suggest you ask yourself as well as your teammate. Think about what's nearby, and by this I mean physically. I mentioned earlier that we had 2 community partners. One was within walking distance, and the second, Western Branch Library, was a 10-minute drive away, and I noticed a distinct difference in my ability to recruit volunteer tutors for the 2 sites based on distance. You might also ask yourself what other organizations nearby us do similar work with similar mindsets, and what skills can our tutors offer to the community. And considering these questions, I would recommend that you think broadly. So rather than thinking of your tutor's ability to assist undergraduate college writers with reading and writing assignments as part of a degree-seeking program, thinking more generally about your tutors as good listeners, as good writers, as knowledgeable about different genres and writing practices, as being passionate about helping others, and just generally friendly individuals. And so you can think about other organizations like libraries, schools, community programs, other nonprofits who might just be generally engaging in literacy work. You might ask yourself if this is a permanent or a temporary fixture as part of your writing center, and if it's a permanent fixture, whose job will it be? Keep in mind that community engagement work is still work, it's labor, and it's not the kind of initiative that you would want to just add on to someone else's plate, assuming that once it's up and running, it's no longer any work, because it's work to cultivate and maintain these relationships. And ultimately, if you need anything out of the relationship, if your institution has given you a mandate to engage in more community engagement, or if you need an output of a certain number of hours done or students interacted with, then it's important to be upfront about that. Also, don't shy away from conflicts when you're forming a new relationship. If there's unexpected elements to the partnership, it's important to be open and flexible and explicit about these concerns as you're engaging with your community partner. At Western Branch, we had some of these tensions, including racial differences. Like I mentioned earlier, the population at Western Branch was African American. I myself am Caucasian, and so were all of the volunteer tutors that I recruited from the U of L English department. So rather than kind of ignore that disparity, it was important for me to talk to the librarians at Western Branch and ask how we could cultivate an atmosphere of trust with the children of Western Branch. And that was done not through just showing up, but through engaging with the children in kind of low-stakes activities that were just fun to try to get to know them as people, rather than say, here I am with my mission to help you, right? That's kind of inherently problematic. There were also age differences. It's pretty obvious, I would think, that if you're talking about tutoring children, that's not something that's in the normal wheelhouse of a college writing tutor. We also had to expand what tutoring meant. Initially, we went into the program thinking that we would be doing one-on-one homework-based tutoring with the children, and that was definitely not what the children wanted. All the children were there after school playing Fortnite on the library computers. So what we had to kind of re-envision what tutoring looked like, and for us that kind of expanded into a definition of any engaging and dynamic literacy reading writing practices. So that became much more of a wider scope, that we would have programming downstairs in the basement of the library where students would do creative writing activities, or they would design comic books, they would write their family stories, or they would write a letter to someone, and they would have snacks, there would be stickers and markers, and there would be a lot of kind of fun people coming and going, very loose and flexible. And that seemed to work a lot better. There was also the tension of continuity. My role as a graduate student, I would phase out of this position as an assistant director, and someone new would be coming in. And so it was important to have kind of a very long handoff of power with manuals and orientations of a new assistant director, and kind of doing the best you can to have a solid bridge between people that were working to coordinate the program. As you're determining your agenda with your partner, it's important to relinquish some control. For example, I would recommend trying to have as many meetings as possible at the community partner site rather than asking your partner to come to campus. As I mentioned before, experimenting with different programming and being flexible, prioritizing long-term relationships over instant success. You may experience instant success when you start a new partnership, but then 6 months later find that you're having a dip in numbers members, and that's not something to be concerned about if you're thinking about the long-term relationship over years rather than thinking about success in terms of weeks. And vice versa at Western Branch, it was very slow going from the beginning. We weren't seeing a lot of traffic. We had to change things up, and then slowly the numbers came up. So it's not to give up in those first few months, but to kind of think about the long-term marathon, right? If you have needs as an institution, stating them outright, coordinating your busy and slow times of the year, which are often not in conjunction as a writing center. Those first few weeks of the semester are often crazy, and that's not even that much of a busy time for libraries versus they're very busy and engaged in the summer, which is a very slow time for writing centers. So that's things to think about. And then up front, making a plan to revisit and have some regular check-ins. As you're performing your community engagement, it's important to track. We used a Google form that I had volunteer tutors complete at the end of every shift, whether or not they engaged with anyone at all, so that it became habitual. And that, rather than being like a big brother type of form, it was more about just saying, tell me what's happening. What are your concerns? Who are you talking to? Are you talking to anyone? What are you talking about? Do you have any good ideas? They were open-ended questions so that the volunteer tutors, could just kind of write their thoughts in. I mentioned before our need to establish trusting relationships, and so we had to be willing to participate in unexpected ways. In our case, the tutors would go to game nights at the library and just engage in general fun board games and charades and things like that with the children that were not literacy-based in order to establish that trust. Invite your community partners to your events at your writing center. Try to minimize any responsibility that they might need, and that I kind of mean things like I would be in charge of tutors that called out sick, tutors that were going to be away for spring break, any library closures, inclement weather, what to do. Like, take that work upon yourself so that your tutors don't become kind of needing supervision from the community site. And test out various communication pathways. Don't always assume that everyone prefers to use email to communicate. Checking in regularly, both informally and formally. We checked in formally twice a semester at the beginning and the end of the semester, but I would informally check in during my shifts every week with my community partner, but also I would check in perhaps monthly with my volunteer tutors, asking how they were doing. Did they need anything? Did they want some readings? Did they want to grab coffee and chat? And that helps you remember to appreciate them and the labor that they're putting forth for your effort. If you do track, sharing that tracking with both your tutors and your community partners, it's often easy for an individual tutor not to see their impact in a larger scale, but such tracking and reports really helps them see that they are achieving good things. And then the community partner can use those quantitative numbers for their own marketing purposes without having to do the labor of kind of assembling that information. And just making sure in those formal check-ins that both parties are learning and growing, that they're getting what they want out of the relationship, and being able to explicitly state, if you're not really meeting your goals, let's just talk about it. What can we do differently? What should we do more of? What should we abandon? Give me your thoughts. I'm not tied to this particular program the way that it is. You should reflect and revise your program regularly. It's impossible to revise and improve upon a program that you can't remember or aren't really aware of what's happening, and that's why tracking is so important. Once you track, you can get a sense of busy time, successful programs, non-successful programs, things that community members might be asking for that you're not actually having to be there in person to receive that information if other tutors are tracking that for you. If something's successful, just do it multiple times. I mentioned earlier a comic book workshop. We ran that several times in a year because the students really enjoyed it. If something's a failure, you kind of have a decision. You might just give it some more time, try it again, try to spread the word differently, or you might say, this isn't working. We initially tried to have a traditional tutoring type model at Western Branch, and that was not working, and we had to intervene after a few months to make sure that we could do something else that was more productive for the children there. And asking for a lot of feedback and incorporating that feedback into your revisions as you go. as I wrap up my presentation, I just wanted to give you a kind of heads up where we are now. Obviously, we're in a global pandemic, so things are not really progressing the way that they had been before. Everything's on pause. The library is closed. There's no face-to-face tutoring at the University Writing Center. But even before the pandemic, there were kind of a perfect storm of things happened. There were surgeries and pregnancies and budget cuts and institutional changes at U of L that meant my position was merged with another assistant director position, kind of consolidating all that labor into one individual. So there were some kind of red flags for the relationship even before the pandemic started. And while that might be a kind of depressing note to end the presentation with, I do believe that once we are back out in the world again, we'll be able to pick up at Western Branch, although it might look differently. Perhaps we'll only do 1 or 2 events a semester. Western Branch has an amazing yearly block party, and I can totally imagine U of L having a table with literacy games and events at that party once a year. So that doesn't negate our past work. We've made a great foundation to make all those future programs more successful because of what we've learned and implemented in the past. So everything is worth it, even if it doesn't always end up glamorous and wildly successful. And I wanted to end the presentation just by mentioning that on the first slide, I included my email address, which is rachel.rodriguez@louisville.edu. If anyone wanted to chat about my program or had any questions about my presentation today, I welcome that so much, and I hope that all of you guys have an amazing rest of your conference. Have a great day.